lesson 2 of our PMP certification training. Once again, my name is Obalim and I'm going to be your anchor person. So in this particular lesson, we're going to be taking a look at the project management framework. Of course, when we talk about framework simply refers to skeletal structure. So in essence, what we're going to be doing in this lesson is to take a skeletal structure look at the whole of the PMP. So what the project management framework lesson is basically all about is, this is where we're going to be telling you all about PMP. So in essence, this is like a high level look at the whole syllabus. And that's one key thing that the framework here is going to be talking about. So in essence, at the end of this particular lesson, you should be able to recognize the roles of project management office, and then also describe the different organizational structures, also be able to differentiate between project lifecycle and product lifecycle, then define and understand project management process map as well as frameworks. So these are the things I hope you'll be able to learn by the end of this very lesson. So first, let's talk about the project management office. For short, this is referred to as the PMO. So the project management office, or the PMO, is simply a department or unit within an organization that oversees the management of projects and programs throughout the organization. So in essence, interpret the project management office as a unit or a department within an organization that is responsible for managing projects. So part of the things that the project management office does includes, one, they provide policies, methodologies, and templates for managing projects within the organization. They also provide support as well as guidance to others in the organization on how to manage projects, train others in project management, and then also in the use of project management softwares. Now, when it comes to the project management office, PMI identified 3 major types of the project management office. And the 3 types of project management office that the PMI identifies includes what we have called the supportive PMO, then we have the controlling PMO, as well as the directive PMO. So I'll talk about the supportive project management office. Supportive project management office is a kind of PMO that provides assistance. That's why it's called supportive assist. So it simply provides assistance to managing project. And that's essentially what the supportive PMO focuses on. Then there's also the controlling PMO. So the controlling PMO, in addition to providing assistance, also comes in with some checks and balances to help in being able to carry out the project. And then of course there's now the directive PMO. So the directive PMO takes ownership of the project. In other words, the directive PMO is accountable for a success or otherwise of any particular initiative or project that is carried out within the organization, and that's exactly what the directive PMOs refers to. So remember, we said that there are 3 types of project management office, which are the supportive, the controlling, as well as the directive PMO. So part of the roles of the project management office, in addition to what we have said so far, would of course include providing policies and methodologies, as well as templates for managing project. Also, they provide support as well as training in the organization on how to manage project. Then also, it is the PMO that provides project managers for ongoing projects in the organization, and then also ensures compliance with all policies, procedures, methodologies, tools, and templates within the organization. Of course, other roles that the PMO can play can include managing interdependencies between projects, also selecting, managing, and deploying shared or dedicated project resources. They can also terminate project when the need arises, and then also they help in providing support through what we refer to as knowledge repositories, as well as training, and then also mentoring. Now, another key term we're going to take a look at is what we refer to as the organizational structure. So I want you to interpret the organizational structure majorly as how people are grouped within an organization, the basis upon which we group individuals who work in the organization. That's one key thing that the organizational structure focuses on. So PMI identifies 3 major types of organizational structures, which are the functional, the projectized, and then the matrix organizational structure. So when we talk about the functional organizational structure, this is a type of organizational structure where staff who work within this organization are grouped according to their areas of specialization. And that's what a functional organizational structure here refers to. So in this organizational structure, project manager typically does not exist. So if you even have anybody who is handling a project here, the person is probably, referred to as a project expediter. So in essence, this person basically facilitates project, but then also reports to the functional manager. So employees here report to the functional manager, who is basically the head of operations or operational units within the organization. And that's typically what happens in a functional organizational structure. So examples of, the units you can have in a functional organizational structure would include marketing, accounting, engineering, accounts, then also you talk about human resources, then also operations. All of these are, various departments that can actually exist within a functional organizational structure. Then there's now the projectile organizational structure. So in a projectile organizational structure, just like the name sound, people are grouped here according to projects. So that's part of the reason why you notice that the organization's resources mostly work on projects. So everybody who is working in this organization is involved in one project or the other. So the project manager has the primary control over resources, and then also team members report to the project manager. And that's typically what happens in a projectile organizational structure. So remember, in functional organizational structure, we said people who work here are grouped according to their areas of specialization. However, in projectile organizational structure, people here are grouped according to project. There's also the matrix organizational structure. So the matrix organizational structure is now a hybrid. In other words, it's a combination of both the functional as well as the projectile organizational structure. And that's exactly what gives us the matrix organizational structure. So if you have a situation where the organization, in addition to having functional roles, also have a unit or a department that is dedicated to carrying out projects, we now refer to that as a matrix organizational structure. So the matrix organizational structure is further divided into three. And then, of course, the three types of matrix organizational structure are, we have what we refer to as the weak matrix, there's the strong matrix, as well as what we refer to as the balanced matrix. So the type of organizational structure that an organization runs to a large extent is dependent on the amount of authority that is granted to the project managers within such an organization. So if we take a look at the functional organizational structure, so this is a functional organizational structure. So remember here, we said that people are grouped according to their areas of specialization with different functional areas. So a typical organizational structure will appear somewhat like this. So you can see the head of the organization. Now, these are the various units or functional units you have within the organization, and everybody who works here is, put within their areas of specialization, and they work within one unit or the other. So yes, you can clearly see we do not have any department that is dedicated to projects, and then also we don't also have the project manager in this case, because the functional managers are typically the head of units within this organizational structure. So it has its own advantages as well as disadvantages. One of the major advantages of running a functional organizational structure is that, one, it is easier to manage specialists. Remember, people here are grouped according to their areas of specialization. So if that's the case, it becomes easier to manage them. Then also, team members report to only one supervisor. That's also one of the major advantages of a functional organizational structure. You don't have this confusion as to, okay, do I report to the project manager or do I report to my functional manager? Also, similar resources are centralized as the company is grouped by specialties. So you have a situation where resources are grouped together by specialties, and then they can begin to harness use of similar resources because of the fact that these are specialties within which that they operate. Then also, there's clearly defined career paths in areas of work specialization. So here you can actually decide to build a career in a particular specialty, say for example accounting or human resource or operations or IT, and that's typically one of the major advantages of running a functional organizational structure. But a major disadvantage of a functional organizational structure is that here people place more emphasis on their functional specialty to the detriment of project. So what that simply means is that in a functional organizational structure, you have a situation where people focus more on their functional roles, and then of course when you give them project tasks, because it's not part of their appraisal, so you see them paying lackadaisical and non-cooperative attitudes to projects, and then sometimes some of them might even go outrightly and make effort to frustrate projects because sometimes they feel that it's an additional work that is being added to their job description. There's also no career path in project management in this type of organizational structure. And here the project manager, when I mean the project manager here, I'm simply talking about anybody who is overseeing project. So the project manager has little or no authority. So that's why here we refer to anybody who is overseeing the project as the project expediter. So this person basically oversees project, but then in order to take a decision, he has to refer to the functional manager to be able to take a relevant decision with regards to how the project will run. So in a projectile organizational structure, like I mentioned here, you can see people here are grouped according to projects. So you can see you have different projects running within the organization, headed by different project managers, and then also who now uses project team to effectively carry out the project. And that's typically what happens in a projectile organizational structure. It also has its own advantages as well as disadvantages. One of the major advantages of running a projectile structure is there's efficient project organization, because in this case people are focused on projects, and because they are focused on project, there's a tendency for them to effectively organize the project. There's also loyalty to the project. Remember, like we mentioned earlier on, since it is project that brought these people together in the first place, then there's a tendency for there to be specific set of loyalty to the project. There's also more effective communication than what you have in functional organizational structure. Reason being that everybody here is working on a particular objective, which is basically the project that they are involved. And therefore, you have project communications clearly mapped out and then also clearly planned out even before the commencement of the project. One of the major disadvantages of running a projectile structure is the fact that when a project is completed, there is no unit or department to go back to in the organization. So in essence, at the end of the project, you notice that the team is disbanded, and that marks the end of the project. There's also lack of specialization in discipline. So what that simply means is you may not be able to say you're building a career within a particular project, just like we used to have in a functional organizational structure. And then also there's a tendency for duplication of facilities as well as job functions. Typically, every project would utilize or would require its own resources to be able to operate. So having shared resources in this case may not be very, very feasible, especially if the projects are dispersed. So you notice that you may not have a duplicity of resources as well as job functions, and that's one key disadvantage of running a projectile structure. And then of course it may also result, because of this duplicity, it may now result in a less efficient use of resources. Then we talk about the matrix organizational structure. Remember we said the matrix organizational structure is basically a hybrid. So it combines and tries to maximize the strengths of both the functional as well as the projectile organizational structure. So in some form of matrix organizational structure, you have a situation where team members actually report to two bosses. For example, in a balanced matrix, you have the project manager and then you also have the functional manager. So team members report to more than one boss. So the project manager as well as the functional manager are those who now the team members report to. So of course, notice that one of the major things that this can actually do is it would actually create some kind of rancor, and then in some cases this actually negates the principle of management, which talks about unity of command, that clearly stipulates that a particular individual should report to only one supervisor. So the matrix organizational structure is further divided into three, which are strong, balanced, and then what we now refer to as the weak metrics. So the forms of metrics organizational structure that the organization runs basically depends on the amount of authority that the organization is willing and able to give out to the project manager. So let's take a look at this particular diagram so that you'll be able to better understand what I have been talking about with regards to authority or the power of the project manager. So in this case, this matrix is going to be used to represent the amount of authority that the project manager has within the organization. So this is our authority axis, and then of course these are now the various organizational structures. So notice that this is a functional organizational structure. So you can see that in a functional organizational structure, the project manager in this case does not have any authority at all. Now this is what we call a weak matrix. So you can see the weak matrix is just very close to the functional organizational structure. In a functional organizational structure, remember I mentioned that you have what we refer to as project expediter, who basically oversees project and then reports to the functional manager and then also takes decision based on the instruction of the functional manager. In a weak matrix, you can have what we refer to as a project coordinator. So project coordinator is slightly higher than that of the project expediter, in the sense that the project coordinator can actually take some minor decisions but not major decisions on the project. But then again, within a weak matrix, the project coordinator or the project manager, that is the person who oversees the project, actually also reports to the functional manager. So this is a balanced matrix. So in a balanced matrix, notice that we have a situation where the authority is shared into half. So there's a 50-50 sharing arrangement between the project manager as well as the functional manager. So this is a situation where you now have two managers, and then of course team members report to both the functional manager as well as the project manager. And this is what happens in a balanced matrix. Then this is a strong matrix. So in a strong matrix, you can see that the authority or the power of the project manager is now significantly higher than that of the functional manager. And then this is of course the projectile organizational structure, where within the project manager has absolute authority. And this is what happens in a projectized organizational structure. So like I mentioned earlier on, the amount of authority that the organization is willing to give out to the project manager is basically one key thing we can also use to be able to define the type of organizational structure that we run. So this is absolutely necessary because of the fact that understanding these different organizational structures can actually help you in answering some questions in the exam. I mean, there's a particular exam question I saw which goes thus: a functional organization secured a contract that is quite instrumental to the survival of the organization. So in the question they now asked, to successfully implement this project, what type of organizational structure should they adopt? So again, I repeat, a functional organizational structure secures a contract that is imminent to the survival of the organization. To successfully implement this project, which type of organizational structure should they adopt? So of course, the answer was a strong matrix. So what would enable the organization to successfully implement such a project would be to basically make the project manager much more powerful than the functional manager, so that the project manager can command resources and then also relevant authority required to successfully implement the project. So here we took a look at the matrix organizational structure. So notice that we mentioned that the matrix organizational structure is further broken down into the strong, the weak, as well as the balanced matrix. So this is a strong matrix. You can see in a strong matrix, you have a department or a unit dedicated to a project, and then you also have a situation where projects are headed by project managers. This is a weak matrix. So you can see in a weak matrix, we have project coordinator who still works within a particular unit in the organization and reports to the functional manager. And then there's now the balanced matrix. So in a balanced matrix, you actually have a project manager who doesn't per se report to the functional manager, but you now have a situation where reports from staff members goes to the project manager as well as the functional manager, and that's what happens within a balanced matrix organizational structure. Now, beyond the matrix organizational structure, we're also going to talk about what we refer to as the life cycles. So there are two major forms of life cycle. We have what we call the project life cycle as well as the product life cycle. So first of all, we're going to talk about the product life cycle. So product life cycle basically talks about the stages a product goes through from inception, that is when the product is introduced into the market, up until when the product is withdrawn or taken out from the market. So the product life cycle typically goes thus. Every product goes through what we refer to as the inverted U curve. What that simply means is that the product goes through certain stages, and these are the stages that typical products go through. So the first stage of the product life cycle is what we refer to as the conception stage. So conception is where we have the birth of the product. That's what happens in a conception stage of the product, where the product is newly introduced into the market. So at the end of the conception stage, if the product secures a situation where demand for the product is greater than the supply of the product, we say that the product is in its growth stage. So at any point in time in the product life cycle, when the demand is greater than the supply, it is said that the product is in its growth stage. And then you now have what we refer to as the maturity stage. This is more like the peak of the product life cycle, where you have both high demand and then high supply. So here you have a situation where the demand effectively meets the supply for that particular product. So at this case, we say that the product is in its maturity stage. Now, don't forget that you may have a situation where at the end of the maturity stage, you may have a situation where demands begin to fall. So if you have a situation where the demand is now less than the supply, then we say that the product is in its decline stage. Product is in its decline stage. And then, of course, if nothing is done, the product can actually be taken away from the market, which is what we now refer to as the withdrawal stage. And that's essentially where the product is effectively removed or taken away from the market. So these are the various stages that a typical product goes through within what we refer to as the product life cycle. So beyond the product life cycle, there's also what we call the project life cycle. So the project life cycle, of course, depends on the control needs of the performing organization. So in essence, when we talk about the project life cycle basically talks about our ability to break down the project into what we refer to as phases or stages of implementation. So the total number of stages or phases that the project has now comes together to make up what we refer to as the project life cycle. So let's say, for example, this is an app development project, and then we have what we refer to as the design stage, and then after the design stage, there is now the development stage, which we refer to as the build, and then there is now the go live stage. So this is what now represents the project life cycle. In other words, from the stage 1, which is the design, up until the go live, all together makes up what we now refer to as the project life cycle. So the amount of phases that the organization decides to break down the project into is totally dependent on the amount of control that the organization wants to have on the project. So that's why we say that the project life cycle is dependent on the control needs of the performing organization. So remember, we talked about the project life cycle. So project life cycle, of course, addresses the question, which of course would include what to do to get the work done. And then also the project life cycle varies by industry. So you may have a situation where different industries have different, project life cycle. And then it can either be what we refer to as plan-driven life cycle or what is now referred to as change-driven life cycle. So when we talk about a plan-driven life cycle, plan-driven life cycle simply is predicated on the fact that we're saying that focus is on the planning. And what that simply means is that if it doesn't work on paper, it will not work in real life. So we try as much as possible to figure it out on paper first before we now begin to look at how we'll be able to, translate it in execution. Then there's also the change-driven life cycle. So the change-driven project life cycle is where the focus is on execution. And then also not just, focusing on execution, we also are available for change. So as much as possible, we're open to making amendments along the line. And this is typically where the agile methodology derives from. And the plan-driven life cycle is typically where the traditional or waterfall methodology comes from. Of course, we're going to talk about this in much more detail as we journey along. And then beyond the project life cycle, we are now going to talk about what we refer to as the project management processes, which of course talks about what to do to manage the project. And then we're going to take a look at the processes one after the other. Don't forget that, like I mentioned earlier on, the PMI project management methodology has what we refer to as 49 processes. And then these 49 processes are now put into what we refer to as process groups. So process groups simply refer to a grouping methodology for your processes. That's exactly what the process group here refers to. And there are 5 process groups within the PMBOK guide. So the 5 process groups that the PMI refers to are, we have the initiating, the planning, the executing, the monitoring and controlling, as well as the closing. So when we talk about initiating simply refers to all activities that we carry out to enable us start the project. Then in planning, this is where we determine the how, the when, as well as the how much that the project is going to cost. And that's what we do during the planning. During the executing, that's when we do. So this is more like the implementation stage of the project. Monitoring and controlling is where we check. We're basically checking what we have in the plan against the data we're gathering in the course of the executing. And then, of course, once we are done, you bring the project to an end. And that's exactly what the closing process group here refers to. So this is typically how these process groups interact within the project. So of course, first of all, we begin with initiating, which is the very first stage. And after the initiating, we now go into planning. Notice that planning and executing goes round and round in circles, because as we plan, we check, and then we do, then we act. As we plan, we do, then we check, then we act on the outcome of that. So it will keep going in that particular cycle until we've been able to deliver the very last, deliverable. And then it now triggers the closing processes, which is essentially where we now bring the project to an end. If you notice, there's now an envelope that envelopes the whole of these process groups, which is what we now refer to as the monitoring and controlling processes. So the monitoring and controlling processes basically now helps us to track, to check in each of these stages or in each of these process groups to be able to determine how well the project is performing, and then if it is in line with the expectations that we have actually derived or we have actually put up in the first instance. So like I mentioned earlier on, the 5 process groups are initiating, and we said that during the initiating, this is where we establish the vision of what the project will accomplish, and then also we define the and authorize the project or a project phase. Then during the planning, this is where we establish the total scope of the project. We also define and refine objectives and plans and plan the course of action required to obtain the objectives and scope for which the project was undertaken. Then during the executing, this is where we integrate and coordinate people and other resources to carry out the project plan and deliver the agreed scope of the project. Then during the monitoring and controlling, here we monitor and measure progress regularly in order to identify variances from the plan so that appropriate corrective actions can be taken when necessary. And during the closing, this is where we formalize acceptance of the product and service or result and bring the project or the project phase to an orderly end. These are specific set of things that actually happen in each of these process groups. So for what we have said so far, notice that this is typically how all of these process groups interact and the results that we get. Remember, we begin with the initiating. Initiating basically is where we get authorization to start with the project. So once we've gotten the authorization to start with the project, then next we go into the planning. So at the end of the planning stage, we get what we refer to as the project management plan, as well as other project documents that will be required to carry out the project. And then of course, this project management plan is now what will now inform the executing of our project. And then then once executing eventually starts, you begin to get what we call work performance data. Basically, you begin to get raw facts about how work is being done within the project. And then this, in the course of implementing the project, you're now checking, which is the monitoring and controlling. So this is where you're now going to be comparing this raw facts with the information or the forecast that you have within your plan. And that will now enable you to derive what we refer to as your work performance information. So in essence, the output we're going to get typically during the controlling stage of our project is our work performance information. So work performance information is basically data that has gone through refinement, has been compared with forecasts that we have in the plan, which of course now enables us to get information, which is the interpreted data that helps us to be able to determine the project variance as well as the index, and also helps us in being able to determine the status of the project. And then of course this will now enable us to determine the overall control we're going to implement, and then ultimately do report with regards to the project status and then send to the relevant stakeholders. So this report can either trigger what we refer to as project change control. In other words, let's say for example, we plan that we're going to be able to implement the stage 1 of this project in 1 month, and that's what we have in the plan. And then we did the executing and got our work performance data, which suggests that the project was implemented in 1 month and 2 weeks. So it was done in 1 month and then 2 weeks. So that's 1.5 months. So it was done in 1 month and 2 weeks. So we now do the controlling where we check, and that's why I said you compare the data against the plan. So when you do that, it simply tells us that we are 2 weeks behind schedule. So we are 2 weeks behind schedule. So this 2 weeks behind schedule is now what we refer to as the information, because you can see the data here now has a meaning, which is essentially what we have explained here. So this report is now sent as communication to relevant team members as well as stakeholders, and that's exactly where this arrow is emanating from. Okay guys, we are 2 weeks and behind schedule with regards to this project. And then of course this can trigger a change request. Either we ask for additional time, or we ask that resources be increased, or that we begin to carry out the activities in a concurrent manner. All of these are now going to be addressed via a change control process. So if the change request is approved, then of course we now need to go back and update any document that the change will affect, which is part of the reason why you're seeing project document update as part of the output here. And then the approved changes will also be communicated to relevant stakeholders, including the project team as well as other relevant stakeholders. And then again, don't forget that these approved changes would have to be replanned and then of course implemented, and we run through this cycle again. So this is typically how these process groups interact with one another in the course of the project implementation. So far so good. Remember we said we are taking a look at the project management body of knowledge, which is the PMBOK, and we are of course, you're looking at the version 6 of the PMBOK. So this is more like a mind map that shows us every component of the PMBOK guide, including the 49 processes, the 5 process groups, as well as the 10 knowledge areas. And that's exactly what we have here. If you remember, in my previous lesson, I made mention of the fact that in the PMI's project management methodology, that there are 10 knowledge areas, 49 processes, as well as 5 process groups. Again, remember when we're defining project management, we said project management has to do with the application of knowledge, and then of course skills, then tools, as well as techniques, in order to achieve the project objectives. That's how we define project management in lesson 1. So remember we took a look at the skills that the project manager should have, where we saw the PMI talent triangle, which of course included technical project management skills, strategic business management skills, as well as leadership skills. So right now we're just looking at the 10 knowledge areas, which of course we have in PMI's project management methodology. So those 10 knowledge areas include integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communication, risk, procurement, and stakeholders. These are the 10 knowledge areas that you have in PMI's project management methodology. And remember, like we mentioned earlier on, there are 5 process groups, which are the initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. So if you take a look from this mind map, you notice that the 49 process is at the heart of it. So in essence, what we're simply saying is that this is the core of the PMBOK guide. So these 49 processes were now put into 2 grouping methodologies. In other words, PMI grouped them in 2 ways. So they grouped them according to, one, what we refer to as knowledge areas. So knowledge areas in this case refers to what you need to understand to be able to carry out the project. That's exactly what we refer to as the knowledge areas. And then also you have what we call the process groups. So process groups is essentially where you now talk about the way or the order in which we actually carry out the project. That's exactly what the process groups in this case actually, represent. And like I mentioned earlier on, these are the 10 knowledge areas and these are the 5 process groups. So to enable us remember the 10 knowledge areas, I usually insist that you know the 10 knowledge areas. Part of the reason why it is necessary is because of the fact that in some questions in the exam, they usually ask for order. For example, they say a project manager has finished performing this process. What next should the project manager do? And that's exactly what we do here when we talk about, the process groups, when we talk about the knowledge areas as the case may be. And that's part of the reason why I usually expect that as much as possible, we all understand or know these knowledge areas off by heart. So we have a mnemonics for the knowledge areas, which of course we refer to as the core creeps. The core creeps. Now, core creep simply stands for integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communication, risk, procurement, and then stakeholders. Just like we discussed earlier on in our very first lesson, which was the free part of this particular training. Remember I told you that these 10 knowledge areas represent aspects of project that need to be addressed or continually addressed throughout the project implementation, factors that we need to worry about, constraints that we need to be able to deal with in the course of the project implementation. So you want to understand the scope, in other words, the boundaries of the project. You also want to be able to determine how long the project will take, then how much, what will be the definition of done, in other words, how do we make sure we have good results, also resource consideration, and then also how we're going to be able to disseminate project information, then be able to address uncertainties, how we're going to be able to buy, and then also carry out contracting, negotiation, as well as claims administration, and how we're going to be able to effectively manage our stakeholders. And then all of this now comes together and forms part of our project implementation, which is now where integration comes in. So integration is basically where we put all of this together to enable us to effectively carry out our project. And essentially, this is the framework of the project management body of knowledge. So in this particular lesson, which is the part 1 of the project management framework, we took a look at what we refer to as the project management office, and we said it's a unit or a department within the organization that oversees the management of project in the organization. And of course, we said that the project management office, that is the PMO, is divided into 3, which are, we have what we refer to as the supportive, the controlling, and then of course the directive PMO. Then we also talked about organizational structures, and we said that organizational structure simply refers to how people are grouped within the organization. Again, here we took a look at 3 organizational structures, which are the functional organizational structure, the projectile organizational structure, and then the matrix organizational structure. So the matrix organizational structure was further broken down into 3, which are the strong, the balance, as well as the weak metrics. Then of course we took a look at life cycle. So in the life cycle, we said that there are 2 major types of life cycle, which are the product life cycle as well as the project life cycle. So for the product life cycle, we say that the typical product goes through 5 stages, which are, of course, we have what we refer to as the conception, the growth, the maturity, the decline, as well as the withdrawal, while the project life cycle talks about the stages that a project goes through from the very first phase of the project up until the very last stage of that particular project. Then again, we take a look at the 5 process groups that we have, which of course included initiating, planning, executing, monitoring and controlling, and closing. And then finally, we now discuss the 10 knowledge areas, which of course we came up with the mnemonics is core creeps, which stands for integration, scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource, communication, risk, procurement, as well as stakeholders. So in the part 2 of this particular lesson, which talks about project management framework, we're going to take a look at the detailed description of each of these process groups, and then also give a high level overview of the 10 knowledge areas as well as the 49 processes, and then also talk about some other keywords that we're going to be seeing much more later in the course of this particular training. I hope this particular lesson has been very informative for you. I will see you in the part 2 of this particular lesson. Thank you for listening.